Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for being here. A couple of weeks ago, the Czar of American Intelligence, Admiral Mike McConnell, was addressing a crowd in Baltimore, and he told this story, which he claimed to be true. It isn't, but bear with me. The commander of an American battle group was doing maneuvers out in the North Atlantic. It's a foggy night. And he gets a radio call saying, advise you to alter your course 15 degrees. Well, he gets on the horn and says, listen, I'm the commander of an American battle group. You alter your course 15 degrees. Call comes back. Captain, strongly advise you to alter your course 15 degrees. Well, now he's really ticked. And he says, listen, I am the commander of a major naval battle group out here. You alter your course. And the call comes back. Captain, this is a Canadian lighthouse. Your call. Now, even though that is not a true story, right, that is an apocryphal story, the CIA has often found itself over the last 60 years in the position of that lonely Canadian lighthouse operator, trying to speak truth to power, the power being the President of the United States. The problem, of course, is that directors of Central Intelligence were not always in possession of the whole truth. And when they were, presidents often didn't want to hear it. This has been one of our fundamental problems down the years. And it's one of the reasons that after 60 years, as the greatest superpower on earth, we still don't really have a first-rate spy service in this country. There are a couple of other reasons I want to address, and I'll try to get to them in a way that is not apocryphal. I think a lot of you remember, looking around the crowd, a little bit what life was like in the early years of the Cold War. We were facing an implacable enemy. We didn't know that much about him. What went on behind the Iron Curtain and behind the bamboo curtain was a deep and abiding mystery. We lived in days of secrecy and ignorance and fear. This is why Harry Truman created the CIA in the first place, back in 1947. Intelligence, ideally, is secret action aimed at understanding or changing what goes on abroad. President Eisenhower called it a distasteful but vital necessity. If you want to project power, you've got to see over the horizon. You've got to know what is coming. You've got to try to prevent attacks. You've got to try to anticipate surprise. That's a tall order. Without strong, sharp, smart intelligence, presidents and generals alike can become blind, can be crippled. But the fact is that throughout our history as a superpower, we really not have had such a service. You'll remember, those of you who were alive back in the 50s, what the consequence of not knowing your enemy was like. Here's a passage from a secret report to President Eisenhower from back in 1954. It is now clear that we are facing an implacable enemy whose avowed object is world domination by whatever means and at whatever cost. There are no rules in such a game. Hitherto acceptable norms of human conduct do not apply. If the United States is to survive, long-standing American concepts of fair play must be reconsidered. We must develop effective espionage and counter-espionage services, and we must learn to subvert, sabotage, and destroy our enemies by more clever, more sophisticated, and more effective methods than those used against us. It may become necessary that the American people be made acquainted with, understand, and support this fundamentally repugnant philosophy. Those words were declassified many years later, but they set the tone for the call that went out to CIA. The CIA grew out of the wartime OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which was by and large a seat-of-the-pants operation. We had no tradition of espionage, of covert action. We got schooled by the British quickly during World War II. Some of the most successful operations of the OSS were paratroop operations. Brave men parachuted behind enemy lines in occupied France, for example, to hook up with resistance forces and sabotage the Nazis. The CIA made a fundamental mistake. It believed that it could operate behind the Iron Curtain and behind the bamboo curtain, the way the OSS had operated in Western Europe during the Second World War. The rules of the game had changed. It was extremely hard, almost impossible, to operate that way against the closed police states of the Soviet Union and Mao's China. One of the deepest secrets of CIA was that during the 1950s, thousands of recruited foreign agents, Russians, Poles, Ukrainians, Slavs, Koreans, Chinese, Vietnamese, were sent out on these suicide missions. Thousands never returned. There was a gap between what the CIA represented itself to be, even to the president, and what the realities were. As one covert operations officer of the day, Don Gregg, who later became station chief and then U.S. ambassador in South Korea, told me for the interviews during this book, the CIA under Allen Dulles in the 1950s had a great reputation and a terrible record. President Eisenhower began to suspect that something was amiss. Operation after operation had been going wrong. And at the end of his presidency, in the last weeks of his presidency, in January 1961, during the same days that he gave probably his most famous speech, best remembered today, warning the nation against the disastrous rise of misplaced power in the military-industrial complex. He had a series of closed-door meetings at the National Security Council in the White House. And it was there that Allen Dulles assured him, Allen Dulles, the director of Central Intelligence, assured him that everything was well in hand. Proposals for reforming the CIA were monstrous, they were madness, they were preposterous. And the president exploded in anger. It had been the job of the director of Central Intelligence not just to run the CIA, but also to coordinate American intelligence, military and civilian. And the president said, the structure of our intelligence organization is faulty. We're just as bad, just as disorganized as we were at Pearl Harbor. I have suffered an 8-year defeat on this, said the president, and I will leave a legacy of ashes to my successor. And 4 months later came the Bay of Pigs. President Kennedy was furious. He wanted to break up the CIA, scatter it to the four winds. Instead, what he did was to hand some of its most dangerous and difficult covert operations to his 35-year-old brother, the Attorney General of the United States, Robert F. Kennedy. We want to believe, as President Kennedy came to office believing, that the CIA was more like James Bond, or today we would say Mission Impossible. We have no tradition of this in this country, and we didn't know what we were doing, not in the beginning. As Richard Helms, who was director of Central Intelligence under Presidents Johnson and Nixon, told me, in the beginning, we knew nothing. If you could get a train schedule, a map, that was pretty hot stuff. Presidents learned this to their dismay. Report after report came in to President Kennedy and later to President Johnson saying, and I'll quote from an after-action report about the Cuban Missile Crisis, "The near total intelligence surprise experienced by the United States resulted in large part from a malfunction of the analytical processes by which intelligence indicators are assessed. The President had been, and I quote, ill-served by the CIA, which had failed to get across to key government officials the most accurate possible picture of what the Soviets were doing." In the absence of hard intelligence about what was going on in a lot of the world, president after president from Kennedy onward turned to covert action instead. There was a divide within the CIA itself on this. There was the action faction, if you would, the covert action faction, and there were those who were devoted to espionage. There was a difference between knowing the world through espionage and trying to change the world through covert action. And as we have learned since, time and again, to our sorrow, action without intelligence is folly. It's a fool's errand. There was a real melancholy moment at the Oval Office on November 4th, 1963. This is on tape. As you know, President Kennedy taped himself, President Johnson taped himself. It didn't start with Richard Nixon. John Kennedy was dictating a memo to himself about a maelstrom he'd set in motion half a world away, which was the assassination of an American ally, the president of South Vietnam, President Diem. The poignancy of this is almost unbearable because this is, of course, 18 days before he himself was killed. And his kids are running in and out of the Oval Office playing. And he says, "We must bear a good deal of responsibility for it." He's talking about the overthrow of an American ally, the president of South Vietnam. And the way he was killed, the president said, made it particularly abhorrent. We came to know latterly in the 70s that there had been assassination plots against foreign leaders, Fidel Castro, for example, that there had been secret prisons, that there had been mind control experiments with drugs, including LSD. And we blame the CIA for these. It was the phrase of Frank Church, who ran the first real full-fledged congressional investigation of the CIA, Senator Frank Church. He wondered aloud whether the CIA had become a rogue elephant, trampling on peoples and nations, his words. With a very few exceptions in the 50s under Allen Dulles, the CIA was never a rogue elephant. When people were trampled, nations were trampled. It wasn't the elephant, it was the mahout, the elephant driver. And he was the President of the United States. It was the job of Richard Helms as Director of Central Intelligence from 1966 to 1973 under Presidents Johnson and Nixon to rededicate the CIA to espionage. The CIA was now 20 years old. It was a mature organization. Many of its people were World War II veterans. They learned quite a good deal from their mistakes. And to its undying credit, the CIA under Richard Helms told the President time and again in 1966 and 1967 that the war in Vietnam was a political war. It wasn't going to be won by military means. Here's what LBJ had to say about that. Pardon my language. I'm quoting the President of the United States. "Let me tell you about these intelligence guys. When I was growing up in Texas, we had a cow named Bessie. I'd go out early and milk her. I'd get her in the stanchion, seat myself, and squeeze out a pail of fresh milk. One day I'd worked hard and gotten a full pail of milk, but I wasn't paying attention. And old Bessie swung her smeared tail through that bucket of milk. Now, you know that's what these intelligence guys do. You work hard, get a good program or policy going, and they swing a smeared tail right through it. You think that was bad? Here's what Richard Nixon had to say about the CIA. This is Nixon. This is a transcript of him talking to his Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. The United States is spending $6 billion a year on intelligence and deserves to get a lot more than it's getting. I will not put up with people lying to me about intelligence. If intelligence is inadequate, if the intelligence depicts a bad situation, I want to know about it. I won't stand being served warped evaluations. I know the intelligence community has been bitten badly a few times, and it tends to make its reports as bland as possible, so it won't be bitten again. I believe that those responsible for the deliberate distortion of an intelligence report should be fired. The time may come when I will have to read the riot act to the entire intelligence community. Now, how do you work for a man like that? How do you try and speak truth to power to a man like that? The fact was that the president cut the CIA off. When he and Kissinger went to deal with the Russians, with the Chinese, with the North Vietnamese, they never told the CIA anything about it. The break with the old CIA happened under Nixon. Jimmy Carter takes the rap for this, for trashing the old CIA. It started with Nixon. It took a long time to rebuild. The analysts, who were really the CIA's heart and soul, the people who gather, collate, tried to understand what was going on in the world, were devastated under Nixon and later in the 70s. These were people who devoted their lives trying to speak truth to power, trying to report to the president about what was going on in the world. Here's the most senior of those analysts talking for the record in the CIA oral history. This resonates today. In retrospect, I do not believe that an intelligence organization in this government is able to deliver an honest analytical product without facing the risk of political contention. By and large, I think the tendency to treat intelligence politically has increased. It's mainly over issues like the war in Vietnam. I think it's probably naive in retrospect to have believed what most of us believed at one time, that you could deliver an honest analytical product and have it taken at face value. I think that intelligence has had relatively little impact on the policies we've made over the years, relatively none. By and large, the intelligence effort did not alter the premises with which political leaders came to office. They brought their baggage and more or less carried it along. Above all, it was the job of the old CIA in the Cold War to know what was going on in the Kremlin. That's a very tall order, to spy on a closed society, to spy on a police state. Nonetheless, that was the job at hand. Here's the Director of Central Intelligence, Bill Webster, talking about the final outcome after 40 years. I had my glass half full guys and my glass half empty guys. On the one hand this, on the one hand that. The CIA didn't know that Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, had told the Warsaw Pact meeting in 1987 that the Soviets would never invade Eastern Europe to shore up their empire. They didn't know that Gorbachev had told the leader of Afghanistan the Soviets were going to start pulling their occupying troops out in 1987, July of that year. And the agency, I remember this vividly, I was there, was really flabbergasted in December 1987 when throngs of thousands of citizens in Washington hailed Gorbachev in the streets of Washington, D.C. as a conquering hero. They just didn't see it coming. The Soviets, God bless them, had their 5-year plans. They never changed very much. It was like looking at a mountain. Occasionally there'd be an avalanche on the side, nothing big. Until one day the mountain blew up. Bob Gates, our President's Secretary of Defense, and a good one, particularly in contrast to his predecessor, was the chief Soviet analyst at CIA for many years. later director of Central Intelligence. He'd never been to the Soviet Union. When he finally got there in '91, Gorbachev saw him coming down off the plane with President Bush the elder, and he said, "So, Mr. Gates, how does it look from the ground?" The CIA had somehow missed the fact that its main enemy was dying. Here's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under George Bush the elder, Admiral Bill Crow, talking. They talked about the Soviet Union as if they weren't reading the newspapers, much less developed clandestine intelligence. No one at the agency actually asked the question that Vernon Walters, the new ambassador to Germany, asked in May 1989 when he arrived, which was, what are we going to do when the wall comes down? We didn't know. The CIA did experience an important glory day, halcyon days, when Bob Gates ran it and when George Bush the elder was president. Bush the elder, of course, had run the agency back for 11 months under President Ford. After the wall came down, as the Soviet Union was crumbling, when the captive nations, the republics of Eastern Europe, began going down, they kept their powder dry. They didn't go dancing on the Berlin Wall. They kept cool. That's an important thing to note in their favor. But when the game was up in 1992, they figured, that's it. It's the end of history. Remember the end of history? And they left. All the veterans left. They walked out the door. And they started walking faster after President Clinton took office. Really, it still astonishes me that anybody that smart could have been so dumb about American intelligence. He really did not care a hoot, nor did he understand what it was there for, which was to try and help him figure out what was going on in the world. He met with his director of Central Intelligence, the first one, twice in 2 years. By the time his third director of Central Intelligence took office in 1996, the place was crumbling. We didn't start paying attention to it at a presidential level again until Al-Qaeda blew up 2 of our embassies at once in 1998. Then that got our attention, because 2 at once isn't twice as hard, it's 100 times as hard. Then the president started paying attention. And the director of Central Intelligence, his third, George Tenet, gathered together his fellow chiefs, and they wrote a secret report to the White House after the embassy bombings. And they said, unless we fundamentally change the way that we gather and analyze intelligence in this country, we are going to suffer a catastrophic systemic intelligence failure. And the date of that report was September 11th, 1998. The catastrophic failure was not September 11th, 2001. That was a systemic failure of the American government to protect its people. You can't hang that on the CIA. It was a failure of the FBI. It was a failure of the FAA. It was a failure of we in the Washington Press Corps, who really didn't understand the threat as well as we should have. The catastrophic failure came a year later, when the CIA issued its reporting on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and reported, as it had for the past 2 years, but now reported in a formal special national intelligence estimate, that Iraq was bristling with chemical and biological weapons. I think we all remember in February 2003, Colin Powell, our Secretary of State, at that point, probably the most trusted American in the world, got up in front of the United Nations, and sitting right over his shoulder was the Director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet. And Colin Powell said, and believed, because George Tenet had told him, that Iraq was bristling with chemical and biological weapons. That was the catastrophic systemic intelligence failure. When intelligence succeeds, it can save lives. It can forestall a coup. it can prevent a war. War is the ultimate intelligence failure. When intelligence fails, soldiers die. The war that we're now engaged in is an intelligence war by and large. It's a war of information and ideas. We're going to win it or lose it based on our intelligence. Today, money's no object at CIA, as it was 10 years ago. Mike Hayden, love him or hate him, is a very capable director. And everybody knows what the mission is now. Nobody's asking what's the mission, the way they were 10 years ago. It's what it always was, to prevent the next Pearl Harbor, to provide the president with the information he needs to construct a strategy for the United States, not for tomorrow, but over the horizon, strategic intelligence. I want to talk during our question and answer period about how we might go about that. But I think it's crucial that Americans understand and that the next president understands that our days as a superpower might be numbered unless we have the very best intelligence. You get good intelligence through espionage, by recruiting foreign agents who know what's going on abroad. We can build all the spy satellites we want at $1 billion a pop, and we do, or we try. And we can build all the electronic eavesdropping stations. We can. But at the end of the day, the only way to know what another person thinks, the only way to know the enemy, is to talk to him. And that is the business of spies. We need a new generation of them to get us the very best intelligence. I thank you a lot. Now, this is always the best part of talking to me, is questions and answers. I want to ask you one thing. Kindly state your question in the form of a question. Thank you.
Is the CIA and you've given a pretty bleak assessment of the CIA. Is the current situation as bad as you have said it's been in the past?
Well, it's not as bad in many ways as it was 10 years ago. However, the president ordered the CIA 3.5 years ago to increase the number of analysts and the number of covert operations officers by 50%. Now. Do it now. Action this day. That's what presidents want. Well, these people don't grow on trees. It generally takes 5 years to train up a new recruit to where they're good to go. The consequences at the CIA today, 50% of the workforce overall, analysts and clandestine operators, have less than 5 years experience. And by the CIA's own standards, they are trainees, and they're not good to go. The good thing is that everybody knows what the mission is. You know, and 10 years ago, people were saying, what is it? In large part because the foreign policy of the United States had no organizing principle during the first, I would say, 5 years of the Clinton administration. Remember, we were going to spread democracy by selling sneakers to the Chinese, something like that. Seems like a long time ago. Kindly use the mics when you can. Sir.
If the Mossad is the gold standard, who is the gold standard then if Mossad isn't?
For us, for the United States, right?
Why would it be so difficult for us to duplicate that?
We're Americans. We're friendly, open people. We like everybody, and we want everybody in the world to be like us. We want them to talk like us. We want them to speak like us. We want them to act like us. By and large, we think foreigners are Americans with funny hats. And the only workable model of a foreign intelligence service that is of use to us as Americans, in my opinion, is the British service in the 19th century. Common ideals, similar problems, that is, global reach, right? But what the British did that we can learn from is extremely important. I know a woman who's in her 70s, a British woman, born in India in the 1930s, the 7th generation in her family of British Foreign Service, intelligence, and military officers. When they had global interests to protect and defend, they went and lived in the countries that they aimed to command and control for generations. They learned the languages, difficult languages, Arabic, Hindi, Urdu, even Pashto, the language of Eastern Afghanistan, which the British called the language that would be spoken in hell. It's a very difficult language. We don't do generations. We do 2-year tours. Do you know how many Arabic speakers there were in the Green Zone in Baghdad at the start of 2007? Among the thousands of military and intelligence and diplomatic officers? 6 Arabic speakers. Now, I grant you Arabic is a difficult language. It takes 5 years to train up. If we're going to do that, if we're going to meet that standard, what we need in this country is a national intelligence university that has the same standards as the U.S. Military Academy, U.S. Naval Academy.
Yes, you sort of answered my question by implying that the British were more into intelligence and covert action, so I'll...
Well, they've been at it since Queen Elizabeth I, 500 years they have practiced.
Were they, one of the themes in your book is how unaccountable the CIA was and how much leeway they had in what they told the president and presidents. Were the British, did they have a better check and balance, and should we be talking with Congress more, or is the nature of espionage
British have a
such that...
system under a monarchy that is inured to secrecy, okay, that is used to secrecy, that depends on secrecy. We're an open American democracy. Part of the struggle of the CIA, and for us all, is how do you run a secret intelligence service in an open American democracy? We don't know yet. We're still working on that problem.
I had 2 questions. In the beginning, you had a quote about the description of the intelligence. Who wrote that?
Which one now?
The fairly lengthy one you wrote in the beginning.
We are now facing an implacable enemy.
Yeah.
That's known as the Doolittle Report. The chairman of this was the first presidential commission to look into the CIA. It was a secret report, secret commission. Jimmy Doolittle is the guy who firebombed Tokyo.
Mm-hmm. The last question was at the end of your talk, you talked about the spies and the satellites in the air or in the space looking down,
Yeah.
which I believe started primarily under McNamara, and he felt, as I understand it, he felt that you could do a lot of that and not have feet on the ground. Has that changed? I wasn't quite clear. Has that changed?
There's a constant debate. It's been going on since the 50s, gadgets versus spies. Okay?
Where is it now? Is it still? I mean, it's still being debated, but which side of the fence are we is winning?
Gadgets.
That's unfortunate. Thank you.
Let me frame my question a little bit. Tom Brokaw went on to say in today's network news that the intelligence failure was attributed to a number of things, not only some bad intelligence, but some deviation, but also to failures on the part of the News Corp. Are you suggesting that George Tenet and Colin Powell were the main failure in lack of intelligence or the reading of it?
The CIA had been reporting since at least 2000 that Saddam Hussein had a huge secret arsenal of chemical and biological weapons. The trouble is that the last boots on the ground of spies, American spies, last set of American eyes, was in December 1998. That's when we pulled the weapons inspectors out of Iraq and resumed the bombing. So their best intelligence toward the end of 2002 was 4 years old.
Nothing in the New York Times or anything saying anything differently?
About the Iraqi arsenal?
Yeah, exactly.
I think everybody believed Colin Powell.
I think you're right.
I think everybody believed Colin Powell. Sir.
I apologize for violating your rule, but you certainly changed my perception of the CIA. But my question is, have any CIA agents or operatives ever been indicted for illegal activities in connection with their work, like Oliver North was?
Richard Helms, in my opinion, probably the greatest director of Central Intelligence, had to stand before a federal judge in 1977 and plead to a federal misdemeanor of failing to fully inform Congress, lying. Helms had been asked under oath whether the CIA had anything to do with the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile, asked by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. No, sir, he replied. Count one. Helms was caught between two oaths, his oath to tell the truth to Congress and his oath of secrecy. A number of senior CIA officers were indicted in the Iran-Contra affair 20 years ago. Some were convicted. All were pardoned by George Bush the Elder on Christmas Eve, 1992. Full and complete presidential pardon. The executive director of the CIA under Porter Goss, who was appointed by George Bush to run the agency in 2004, is currently under indictment for something very different, which is bribery and kickbacks. Nothing like that had ever happened in the history of the CIA, not in the executive branch. Espionage is illegal everywhere. When you're a covert operations officer overseas, you are breaking the law of the country in which you're working, by definition, okay? Even though espionage is often called the world's second oldest profession, it is still illegal everywhere. You have to live as a species of legal criminal when you're a clandestine services operator. And you have to be good at it, or you're going to get busted. That's not fun. The trouble is, you live that life, you have to have a very good moral gyroscope to then come back to Washington, D.C. and deal with your fellow Americans. It takes a special breed of cat to do it.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your talk, and I'd like to ask you about the title of your book, Legacy of Ashes, and the story you began your talk with. What do you think of the review that appeared in the Journal of U.S. Intelligence Studies, written by Nicholas Dujmovic, the CIA historian, entitled A Sneering Distortion of History, in which he cites the transcript of the National Security Council meeting you refer to and says you invented and created the dialogue and the exchange. It never happened that way, and that Eisenhower was not referring to Dulles or the CIA when he talked about a legacy of ashes. And he reproduces the transcript of the meeting.
As I cite the transcript in my book, at all three meetings. Nick is very mad about the book. I know him a little bit. And his review is a hatchet job.
Is what?
A hatchet job. I think he thinks the same about my book, with all due respect to him.
Was Eisenhower referring to the CIA and to
He was
Allen
referring,
Dulles?
as I write, to Allen Dulles' role as Director of Central Intelligence in coordinating American intelligence.
What about the transcript that he reproduces that shows
I've
he
got
was...
the transcript cited in my book. The transcript is on the web. It's for all to see.
Okay, thank you.
Nick, for those of you who didn't follow that exchange, Nick is a very good, actually, CIA historian who knows a great deal about what he writes about when he writes about his own work. I respectfully disagree with his criticism.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, now Eisenhower is looking a lot better in retrospect.
He really
but
isn't he?
Well, he is, but he was the one that set into motion the overthrow of Mossadegh, the rogue operation in Malaysia, which just turns on its head everything I thought about Malaysia.
Malaysia or Indonesia?
Indonesia, sorry, Indonesia. And also, he advised Kennedy to go ahead with the Bay of Pigs operation. So why the credit he's getting now, given what took place under his administration and afterwards when he advised Kennedy to go ahead with the Bay of Pigs?
I'm not sure I entirely agree with the go-ahead on the Bay of Pigs. I think it was all left very ambiguous in the transition. Transitions are dangerous times, the handoff of power. And the constant between the two administrations was Allen Dulles. And Allen Dulles stood in front of President Kennedy's desk and said, "Mr. President, slam dunk. Don't worry about the Bay of Pigs. We got it covered." And the origin of the idea of overthrowing Mossadegh and installing the Shah in Iran began with the British. Winston Churchill wanted his oil back. And on Indonesia, I think that's one instance of a very few where the CIA in the Dulles years slipped the bonds of presidential power just a bit, exceeded its instructions.
To get back to the electronics question, who's going to do the history of NSA?
Well, there was a pretty good one a while back by Jim Bamford. And it's a little nerdy, but it's good. The NSA is a fascinating place. For those of you not familiar with it, this is an organization much larger than the CIA that conducts electronic eavesdropping overseas and now, by all signs, within the United States, under presidential command. And it'd be a fascinating book. But Jim Bamford's book, which I think is now 25 years old, is the only decent history I've read. There is a guy named Matt Aid who, last I heard, was working on a 3-volume history of NSA.
So you're not going to do one?
No, sir. Not this lifetime.
Given everything you have said about the CIA, who or what is responsible for the fact that there hasn't been another attack on American soil since 9/11?
This we do not know. My best guess is that it's a combination of factors. The continuing American presence in Afghanistan disrupted al-Qaeda's operations there. No question about that. The dragnet, if you will, the global dragnet that rounded up thousands of terrorist suspects, there were 1 or 2 or 3% of those thousands of people who were actual dangerous terrorists. I believe the head count is 14 right now. That's significant. I mean, it's 14 out of several thousands, but my best guess, and I must emphasize this is a guess, okay, is that the hardcore operational leadership of al-Qaeda is probably a couple hundred people tops. The people who are actually capable of doing stuff. They may feel they have won. They have permanently, for the foreseeable future, disrupted American society. But that is a wag. You know what a wag is? A wild ass guess.
Yeah, I would think Al-Qaeda dreams had come true. If the CIA got it wrong about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, did the UN get it right? And if so, how did they do it?
Did the UN get it right?
Yes.
I would say they were less wrong. They had more human source reporting. That's how.
Makes sense.
Can you comment on the status and the ramifications of the Valerie plane outing?
That was, in my opinion, a consequence of sniping between the White House and the CIA. Consequent to the weapons of mass destruction reporting. There was a pretty bare-knuckled political operation to squelch critics of the administration. Her husband was one, Ambassador Joe Wilson. The original idea was to somehow damage her through him by outing her. It had very little to do with the CIA itself, and a lot to do with the political hardball as played by the Office of the Vice President in 2003 and 2004, and certain members of the Washington Press Corps who acted as stenographers or transmission bells for senior members of White House staff.
Did the CIA ever take a position on the October surprise, knowing that Bush the Elder was a director just after that occurred?
The short answer to your question is there was no October surprise. For those who remember this or don't remember this, this was the idea that there was going to be some last-minute, solution to the hostage crisis before the 1980s elections, and that certain members of the Reagan campaign team, namely William Casey, who became Reagan's director of Central Intelligence, were somehow manipulating behind the scenes. I don't think it ever happened, and I don't think there's any evidence that it did.
Did you read Gary Sick's book on that?
All Fall Down?
Right.
A long time ago.
Yeah, okay. Well, William Casey couldn't remember a thing when he was questioned about this.
No, he could remember, it's just he couldn't understand a word he was saying.
Right. Thank you.
Do you comment on the relationship between the CIA and the FBI and how that might have changed?
Chalk and cheese. J. Edgar Hoover hated the very idea of the CIA. Hoover wanted to run his own worldwide intelligence service. He gleefully kicked them in the shins pretty much every chance he got. The deep history of this is that during the 1950s, in the heyday of Senator Joe McCarthy, who some of you doubtless remember vividly, the State Department under John Foster Dulles in 53 was purged of suspected communists, suspected socialists, suspected liberals, and some pretty middle-of-the-road people. The CIA became kind of a liberal refuge in the early 50s. And it was one of the CIA's darker secrets of the era that they were actually working with the center-left parties of Europe to split them off from the communists. They were working with socialists and supporting little socialist magazines. And boy, if that had ever gotten out, in the early 50s, there would have been hell to pay. Allen Dulles, to his credit, protected and defended the CIA against McCarthy. And J. Edgar Hoover was very suspicious of this. But it transcends the personal, animus of J. Edgar Hoover. The jobs are fundamentally different, FBI and CIA. An FBI agent confronted with an evildoer wants to string him up. A CIA officer, an intelligence officer, confronted with an evildoer wants to string him along, okay, and find out what he knows, all right, and see where it leads, because the instant you string him up, the intelligence case is closed. What's fascinating about what's developing now, and this is going to take years to pan out, is that the FBI, since 9/11, has had to confront the fact that it needs to be less of a law enforcement agency and more of an intelligence agency. And intelligence and law enforcement, boy, that's a tough mix. It's a tough mix. Intelligence secrets can't be revealed in open court. Well, how are you going to make a criminal case, right, if you can't talk in open court? It's a real problem. And the adaptative challenge to the FBI after 9/11 is how to think like an intelligence agency when the whole culture of the FBI for 100 years has been all you really need to get the job done is a badge and a gun.
My question may go a little bit beyond your professed expertise, but we're all brilliant in hindsight, looking back at what's happened. What's your advice to our next president? Where do we need to go? How do we get there? Where are the areas we most need to focus?
I mentioned in passing before that I think we need to train up a professional intelligence officer corps in this country. And that one way to do it would be a national intelligence university. Another way to do it is that there already exists and has existed since 1991 something called the Boren Scholarships, named after Senator David Boren of Oklahoma, who used to be the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Community. And these are specifically designed to be national security education grants for undergraduates and graduates, precisely to train them up in foreign language, foreign history, foreign culture. The Congress, in its wisdom, last time I checked, funds these programs at $2 million a year. We are spending $2 billion a day on the military. It might not be a bad idea to beef that up a little bit. I think the next president of the United States, whoever he or she is likely to renounce terror as an instrument of American foreign, to renounce torture as an instrument of American counterterrorism and American foreign policy. John McCain knows a lot about torture. He spent 5.5 years in a prisoner of war camp, getting tortured pretty much every day. My guess is he's against it. This is a very tough one to get right. We need the best intelligence. We need a revitalized espionage service in this country. The CIA should not function as a kind of a secret military police, running jails, interrogating prisoners. The job is espionage. It's a difficult, dangerous job. It's extremely hard. It takes an incredible amount of devotion to get it right. You have to be willing to spend your life in secret, in anonymity, working for your country abroad. There has to be a public call to do this secret work, or we're going to have to bring back the draft. Our military is exhausted. The Army is bushed, tired. It's got sand in its gears. Our diplomacy is withered. Our intelligence service is stretched to or beyond its capabilities, in part because of the way in which we have fought the war on terror. It was relatively easier during the Cold War to recruit foreign agents from the communist world. because we stood unequivocally for freedom and justice and democracy. We were the light of the world. Can you imagine how hard it is to recruit Islamists from the Mediterranean to the Pacific? Because, in part, of the way we have conducted the war on terror. Colin Powell recently said that people are beginning to question the moral basis for our war on terror. The next president has to fix that.
Mike, I have another question,
Yes.
but you can reject it because it's not my turn, really. But what our whole concern in America is, Al-Qaeda and what's happening in Afghanistan, what's happening in Iraq. Did we make the right decision? How do we avert a further attack? Where is there a possibility for dialogue? Why?
Between whom and whom?
I read in the New York Times this morning about this woman in Belgium, born there or raised there most of her life, but rabid, as effective for Al-Qaeda as bin Laden himself, but with her words, with blogs, and gathering women as she herself is never going to put herself in harm's way because she believes her mission is words. How do we speak to these people? How do we as Americans understand why they're so mad at us? What we can do to bridge the gap? Where can we ever meet and find a way to peace? Again, turn, but.
If I knew that, no, I'm sorry. I don't mean to give you a flip answer. In part, this is a war of information and ideas. Intelligence is, in some regards, $1 billion word for information. Okay? Our ideas are better than their ideas. Okay? The ideas upon which America was founded are much better than their ideas. I have spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, going back 20 years. I've spent a fair amount of time in Pakistan as well. That's where the battlefield is, and it's a battlefield that will be shaped with information and ideas. You can do a lot, you can win a lot of hearts and minds building schools, building canals for fresh water, doing the sort of thankless grunt work that NGOs do. Win a lot of hearts and minds. This is not a war that's going to be won with smart bombs. Sir. Somebody, I think maybe it was Bernard Fall, the French journalist, once went to Hanoi during the Vietnam War and asked Ho Chi Minh what he thought of the French Revolution. And Ho said, "It's too early to tell." Homeland security is a monster, with many, many, many moving parts and something like 200,000 people. And you've got to get email systems that talk to each other. You've got to, where does the FBI fit in all this? The FBI can't even email itself. I'm serious, okay? This is 2008. In the beginning, in 04, 05-ish, Homeland Security was really a lot of very young people running around with clipboards up on Nebraska Avenue in Washington, D.C. Some of them selected for their, service to the National Republican Party rather than their expertise in Homeland Security. You've got to meld different cultures. I mean, the Coast Guard has been with us since 1789. It's as old as the Constitution. How are you going to meld the Coast Guard and the Border Patrol and the Immigration Service and make them all, you got uniform issues here, I'm serious. You got turf, all right? It's too early to tell. I'm told 2 more questions. Why don't we make it 3 since there are 3 people standing? Sir, and then you, and then you. How's that?
I just have 2 brief questions.
All right.
The first is, it's with the issues at Guantanamo, is any of that being shared with the CIA? If it's information or not, I've heard things coming from there. And the second is the officers who were indicted in absentia in, I think it was Italy, in
Right.
reference to the secret prisons. Is anything going to come of that?
Well, the Italian criminal justice system grinds exceedingly slow, as you might imagine. And the new prime minister of the country, the media magnate Berlusconi, is a material witness in this case. So my guess is probably not that will wind up, spinning into oblivion, the case. And your question about Guantanamo was?
Is any of that information being shared with the CIA? Is it all
Oh, yes.
kept with the military? Okay.
Oh, no.
No, that's it.
In that particular sandbox, they play well.
Thank you.
Sure.
Shortly after JFK was elected, Eisenhower called him in his office and asked him what command and control he had. And JFK alluded that he had command and control set up. And when
Of nuclear weapons or of the government?
No, just of running the government, the military,
Right.
and so forth. And then we had the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And that was the first incident where Khrushchev, who was in Stalingrad, could sense that maybe this guy was a lightweight. And then when JFK visited Khrushchev in Vienna, Khrushchev felt, yes, we do have a lightweight here. And
Right.
of course, the Berlin Wall went up and so forth. My question is this. There was a carrier off the coast of the Bay of Pigs. Under the Eisenhower-Allen Dulles plan, was there going to be an invasion?
Eisenhower never approved an
Never
invasion of Cuba.
approved invasion,
Eisenhower did not approve an invasion of Cuba.
Okay. Second question is, if JFK had allowed the B-26s to
One of the great what-ifs of history.
Yeah, but what I'm wondering is, did they have, the Cuban refugees or freedom fighters, did they have the wherewithal to be able to compete and defeat Castro?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Fidel had 60,000 men in arms. The brigadistas organized by the CIA were 1,500. This is why the Bay of Pigs is, an eternal euphemism for a snafu. I don't have to spell that out for you, do I? No, it was hopeless. It was hopeless.
There were a lot of people at the time that said that JFK should have said, we have a Monroe Doctrine, and we don't let foreigners come in and mess around with the Western world.
One of the lessons of the Bay of Pigs is that if you want to change history, send in the Marines.
This is sort of a peripheral issue, but in regard to going into Iraq the last time, I think you said 1998 was the last boots we had on the ground.
I believe it was December 98.
And Judith Miller was sort of a plan.
Oh, is this going to be a Judy Miller question? I abstain.
And that story, I don't know if that New York Times has covered it yet, about the administration planting generals in strategic spots in the media so they could
Right. Yeah.
promote
Question?
their cause. The question is, do you think the media will do a better job investigating and reporting? And can they do a better job with the corporate control of media?
Well, that is a very good question. I was a Washington correspondent off and on from 1986 to 2000, with a lot of overseas jobs in between. In the early mid-90s was probably the heyday of what Bob Gates used to laughingly call the great oxymoron CIA openness, which he said was like talking about jumbo shrimp. I would like to think that the jobs of being a foreign correspondent, being a Washington correspondent, and the jobs of an intelligence officer are not dissimilar. When we actually get together and let our hair down, we have common ground to talk about. Working overseas, trying to figure out the complexities of the world. I'm talking about retired officers, not serving officers, okay? That was a long time ago, and since the early mid-1990s, the number of American newspapers has dwindled. Corporate concentration of ownership of newspapers has increased. The number of foreign correspondents has plummeted. The number of Washington correspondents has fallen too. And the power of newspapers has both been concentrated in fewer hands of now really a handful of zillionaires we're talking about here. And there has been an abridgment of the power of the press, part of which is our own damn fault. If this gets any worse, and if the aforementioned zillionaires don't act with wisdom, and here I'm talking about the owners of my newspaper, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, which are really the only papers with national scope left in this country. If they don't act wisely, we are going to be in a position where the primary purveyor of information about the American government is the American government. And that will be bad for representative democracy in this country. I'm going to leave you with a quote from James Madison. A popular government without popular information is but a prologue to a tragedy or a farce, or both. Thanks.